I tried marbling paper using only dish soap and ink, and the results were incredible. If you want to learn paper marbling at home without special supplies, this video is for you. This is the 1,000-year-old Japanese method of paper marbling, considered the original marbling. It's called Suminagashi, which means floating ink. The only essential supplies you need for Suminagashi are ink, water, dish soap, and some paper to print on. While the supply list is short, the list of techniques you can try isn't. Today, I will show you how to get started with Suminagashi and 8 amazing techniques you can try to create stunning prints like these. Now, I've been experimenting with Suminagashi for years, and I've watched a ton of paper marbling videos, but a couple of the methods I'm showing you today are completely unique. I have never seen anyone else demonstrate them here on YouTube, and they totally change the kind of patterns you can make. We'll start with the basics so you can see how Suminagashi works, and then we'll build up to those never-before-seen techniques that open a whole new world of possibilities for marbled papers. To help you remember all the techniques I'm about to share, I made free printable prompt cards. They have photos of each technique and step-by-step instructions. You can print them as large 3.5 by 5 inch cards or fold them in half and glue them together to make smaller double-sided cards. Sign up for my email list below the video and you'll get access to my free resource library, including these prompt cards. The setup for Suminagashi is really simple. You need a tray of water large enough to fit the paper you want to print on. The water only needs to be 1 to 2 inches deep. This is an inexpensive paper tray I found in the school supplies section. A white tray or a clear tray with some white paper underneath is ideal so you can see your design while you're marbling. Let your tray of water settle for a few minutes before you start marbling. Any movement on the water will affect your prints. For the clearest prints, it's best to rinse the papers after printing. For that, I set up a second tray of water just off to the side where I can rinse excess ink off the prints. I also set up a space next to my rinse tray where I can lay my wet prints to dry. You'll need a separate dish with a tablespoon of water. Add 1 drop of dish soap to the water and set it off to one side of the tray. On the other side, set out a small dish or a palette for ink. The traditional ink for Suminagashi is black Sumi ink, which you can get at the craft store or art supply store. Pour a small amount of ink into the dish. This technique requires very little ink, so don't pour out too much. Grab 2 pointed round brushes that are similar in size. You can use watercolor brushes for this. I have an old, cheap brush I'm using for the ink and a watercolor brush that's close to the same size for the soapy water. You also need absorbent paper to print on. Traditionally, Suminagashi is printed on rice paper like this. Rice paper has a smooth side and a rough side. Print on the smooth side. If you're using this brand called sketch paper, be aware there are 2 different types. The 6JM is not strong enough for Suminagashi. It rips easily when wet. Instead, use the 6H that comes in a 9 by 12 inch pad. Today, I'm actually printing on rice paper I purchased at Daiso. I tested a few of their calligraphy papers, and this one, labeled as best for school children, worked the best for Suminagashi. It is quite strong when wet, so it won't tear easily, and the ink prints clearly on this paper. I've cut my papers in half, so these are about 6.5 by 9 inches. When you're just learning Suminagashi, I think it's easier to print on smaller papers. You don't have to use rice paper. You can experiment with other papers too. The best papers will be uncoated and unsized. They need to absorb the ink quickly. Watercolor paper does not work well. The last supply that's helpful is strips of newspaper or scrap paper. You can use these to skim the surface of the water to remove excess ink after taking a print. You can also skim the water before you begin to make sure there aren't any impurities on the surface of the water. We're ready to begin. Load 1 brush with the soapy water mixture and make sure it's not dripping. Load the other brush with ink and wipe off any excess so the brush is full but not dripping. Start by touching the tip of the ink brush to the surface of the water. You'll see a thin veil of ink shoot out across the water. Then touch the tip of the soapy brush in the same spot on the surface of the water. The soap will push the ink away and create a clear circle in the middle of the ink. Alternate touching the ink brush and the soap brush to the surface of the water to create rings of ink separated by clear rings. The rings will get narrower as they push out to the edges of the tray. You can reload your brush as needed, especially if you notice the ink or soap isn't spreading as far when you touch the brush to the surface of the water. You can continue creating as many rings as you want. When you're ready to print, hold your rice paper smooth side down in a U shape. Gently lower the center of the paper onto the surface of the water and let go of the sides. You'll see the ink absorbs instantly. If you see any bubbles or white spots, gently press them into the water with your finger so they don't keep the paper from touching the ink. Don't leave the paper in the water too long. The print is done immediately. Pick up the print from two corners and pull it up out of the water. You can rinse the excess ink off the paper in your rinsing tray. Then lay the print flat to dry. If there's still ink on the surface of the water, you can take a second print. It will be much lighter than the first, and the pattern will be completely different because of the movement on the water when you took the first print. At the end, I'll show you what all the prints look like when they're dry. Skim the surface of the water with newspaper to remove any remaining ink and prepare for the next technique. Before I show you more techniques, I want you to know that you can do Suminagashi with color too. These colorful prints were done with the same technique, just ink, water, and soap. If you'd like me to make a video about how to do color Suminagashi, including what inks to use and how to get these multicolor effects, let me know by leaving a comment below the video. You can create patterns with multiple sets of rings too. For this design, I started creating rings on the left side of the water, then I started again with ink on the upper right side. You can continue starting in new areas, creating as many rings as you want. You'll notice this creates a lot more movement on the surface of the water and the rings start expanding into each other and changing shape. You can also create rings in the open spaces between other rings. When you see a pattern you like, you can stop and take a print. I'm turning my paper here to print just the right side of the tray. After I pull the paper out, the remaining ink on the left side moves around and spreads across the surface of the water. If you like the pattern it forms, you can take a second print. Before we go any further, I just want to show you some of the things that you can do with these prints. So, of course, you could frame them if you take a really beautiful print, but you can also use them to make other things. So you might have seen some of these pages in my mark making journals. Here's one where you can see the light blue marbling, and I use those lines as a guide to do some mark making around. You can also use Suminagashi papers to make little books like this. This is a thicker mixed media paper that I turned into a mini book. You can bind the prints in other ways, like this one with removable pages. This doesn't have a cover yet, but I wanted to bind together some of these other blue Suminagashi prints. Here's another small book I made. I actually laminated one of the prints to make the cover and then created full page spreads with the prints. The rice paper is really beautiful to use for bookmaking. You can also use these papers for folding projects. They're great for origami. Rice paper is really forgiving to fold with. I turned this Suminagashi print into a little paper box that collapses completely flat. You can put it inside a journal or a book for a hidden little compartment. So that's just a few ideas of what you can do with your Suminagashi prints. Let's get back to the techniques. For this next technique, I skimmed the water first. Then I started creating rings in the center. I'm alternating the ink brush with the soapy brush. The rings always look lighter when you start because the ink is spreading all the way across the surface of the water. As you add more rings, the ink starts to consolidate and looks darker. I'm adding a lot of rings for this one. Then I'll show you an easy trick to manipulate the ink and completely change the pattern. As you've seen in the other prints, any movement on the water causes the ink to move around and changes the pattern. It happens incidentally while you're printing, but you can use it intentionally to create interesting patterns. Here, I'm using a small piece of cardstock to fan the water back and forth, and it's making the ink rings move. Because I'm fanning back and forth, the ink rings start to zigzag, but they remain separated by the clear rings. Once you get a pattern you like, you can take the print. When I laid the paper down for this print, I got nervous and hesitated, which made some marks across the paper. It takes practice to lay the paper down smoothly. Honestly, it's a bit nerve-wracking trying to do this while filming with a camera in my face. But I'm glad this happened so I can show you what to expect. You'll probably get these hesitation marks sometimes too. It just means you didn't put the paper down smoothly. By the way, if you get hooked on this and want a masterclass in the absolute basics, go watch Liz Chatterton's channel. She has a fantastic beginner series on Suminagashi that covers every troubleshooting question you could ever think of. I'll link her below, but stick around because we're about to get into some really exciting techniques. Let me show you another cool way to manipulate the ink on the surface of the water. I started this print the same way by alternating ink and soapy water in the center of the tray, creating one large pattern of concentric rings. This time, instead of fanning with a card, I'm blowing across the surface of the water. You can see the blowing is causing the ink to separate and swirl toward the top edge of the tray. I'm going to continue blowing in the same direction. A current starts forming in the water, and now the ink is swirling in two large spirals. Then I laid the paper on top to capture the pattern. I hesitated a bit on this one too, but the center of the print is gorgeous. Up until now, we've been creating prints with large swirls. Now I want to show you how to get smaller spirals and busier patterns. These techniques will be important for later when I show you the new methods I've discovered, which look best with a busy, dense marbled pattern. For this print, I'm making multiple rings across the surface of the water. I like using this method to get a lot of ink on the surface. Because the rings are running into one another, the ink doesn't spread as far and you get darker rings. Once I have good coverage on the surface of the water, I'm going to use a toothpick to change the pattern. I'm pulling the toothpick back and forth through the water. The toothpick is breaking the surface tension of the water and causing the ink and soap on the surface to spiral in a new, smaller pattern with finer lines. This technique creates stunning, highly detailed marbling patterns, and all you need is a toothpick. This time, instead of taking a second print or skimming the water, I'm leaving all that ink on the surface and I'm going to add some more. You see, if I just start making rings again in the middle, the new ink will push out the ink that's still on the surface, which retains its marbled pattern. You can start multiple new ring patterns across the surface of the water. I should mention that if you hold your brush on the surface longer, you can deposit more ink or soap. That allows you some control over how wide the rings are or how much space is between them. If you're holding the brush to the water and the ink isn't spreading out, it means you need to reload your brush with ink. The same goes for the soap brush. If it's not pushing the ink away, you need to reload with soapy water. I'm not trying to make a particular design here. This is actually quite ugly, but stick with me. I just want to get more ink on the surface so I can show you this trick. I'm spraying the surface of the water with rubbing alcohol, and instantly you see two things happening. Some of the ink starts to sink in the water, and the ink that stays on the surface breaks up and swirls in a totally different way. It might look like I completely messed this up, but you'll be amazed at how incredible this print looks. I'll be able to show you the details better once it's dry. That method for using rubbing alcohol is very unpredictable, and it can make your water pretty murky. The good thing is the ink below the surface of the water doesn't matter. Any ink that sinks won't affect your future prints. You don't have to change the water unless it gets too murky to see the designs you're creating on the surface. Let me show you another way you can use rubbing alcohol. I started this print with some simple rings. I unscrewed the cap from my rubbing alcohol spray bottle, and I'm using the rubbing alcohol in the tube to drip onto the surface of the water. Where a drop of rubbing alcohol hits the water, it causes the ink to spin out in mini spirals. Dripping the rubbing alcohol doesn't disturb all the ink on the surface. It only disturbs the ink right where the drop falls. This gives you a little more control than the last method. For even more control, you can touch the end of the tube from the spray bottle directly onto the surface of the water. I tried to print the middle section of the tray here, but every time I turn my paper portrait style, it doesn't print as well. So keep that in mind. For me, I think it's because I'm working around the camera and the paper is closer to the edges of the tray when I place it that way. It's nice to have some space around on all sides of the paper so you can set it down evenly. Next up, I want to show you 2 easy patterns you can create with a strand of hair. I know that sounds weird, but trust me, it works and produces an effect that's hard to get any other way. Start by creating rings of ink on the surface of the water. I'm doing 1 set of concentric rings, but you can use this technique with any pattern. I have a strand of hair and I'm pulling the end of it through the water. I'm pulling from the center of the tray where I dropped the ink outwards towards the edges. The hair is so fine, it pulls a line through the ink, but it doesn't cause any spiraling. I'm starting in the middle each time and pulling outward at different angles. When you go from the center of the rings outward like this, it creates a spider web-like pattern. You can also do the opposite and pull the strand of hair from the edge toward the center. When you pull inward like this, it creates a flower-like pattern where the ink rings form petal-like shapes between the divisions. Because you're pulling toward the center, the ink will swirl in the middle and create a cool marbled pattern in the center of the flower. Okay, let's get to the new methods I promised you. I discovered this first one through experimentation. I wanted to see if you could block out part of the paper so it stays white and doesn't get printed. You can't really use masking fluid or anything sticky on the rice paper to mask it. So I tried something else that I didn't expect to work, but it did, and it's incredible. I think this works best when there is a high contrast between the masked area and the marbled area of the paper. So I'm setting this up with lots of ink. Then I'm using my soapy brush to pull through the water just like I did with the toothpick. It makes the ink rings break up and form smaller spirals. This dense, busy pattern is the perfect background for this masking technique. After setting up the ink, I floated masks on the surface of the water. These masks are plastic, like stencils. I actually cut these masks by hand from Yupo paper. Try to lay the mask down gently so you don't disturb the ink pattern too much. So first, you float the masks on top of the water, then you lay your paper down over the masks. You can push the paper down slightly to make sure it all comes into contact with the ink. Don't worry, it still won't print where the masks were. The masks already picked up the ink in those areas. Carefully pull your paper out of the water and rinse it off. I'm going to do another print just like that with different masks. I'm setting up the ink and using a toothpick this time to stir it up. For this design, I'm using my well-loved leaf stencils. These are hand cut from Yupo paper too, and they're covered in acrylic paint right now, but they still work. I'm floating the leaf masks on the surface of the water. I tried to lay them down close together so I can capture them both on my paper. Then I carefully put the rice paper on top and push it down slightly. You can see the water was moving more and the mask on the right shifted downward when I put the paper down, so that area of the paper was blank because the mask picked up the ink before the paper touched the surface. But the print is still stunning. This technique works with stencils or masks as long as they are plastic and float on water. This is an example I made with a stencil. It works best if the stencil has large openings or if you have a very small marbled pattern. It also works on different types of paper. These prints are on rice paper and these are on lightweight mixed media paper. As you can see, it also works with colored inks. Let me know in the comments if you want a video on color Suminagashi. This next new method I discovered accidentally. I picked up a piece of rice paper with wet fingers, and when I took a print with it, nothing printed where my wet fingerprints were. The ink will only absorb into the rice paper if it's dry. I haven't seen anyone demonstrate this technique before, but I think it has a lot of potential for adding mark making to marble designs. When I do this method, I set up the ink on the surface of the water first. It can hang out there while I get the paper ready. I put a piece of rice paper onto a small sheet of acrylic so I can hold it over the tray and show you what I'm doing. You can just do this off to the side on your work surface. I have a jar of clean water and a clean watercolor brush. I'm using the brush to paint watermarks on the rice paper. I may have put mine a little too close together here. Remember, water spreads quickly on rice paper, so your marks will expand. As soon as I finish painting the water, I pick up the piece of paper and flip it over. I lay it gently onto the ink. You can see the wet marks completely resist the ink. Just imagine the patterns and designs you could create with this technique. One bonus technique I want to show you is layering. Remember those ghost prints I took at the beginning? They're beautiful in their own right, but you can also print over them again to create a layered effect. The initial print needs to be completely dry before you print over it. This one has a light gray marbled design. I'm creating a new design on the water with darker, bolder rings to contrast with the light print that's already on the paper. When I laid this paper down, I got more bubbles under the paper because the paper was slightly buckled from the first print. In the future, I would iron the paper before reprinting. On the wet print, it's hard to see the layers, but I'll show you close up once it's dry. This layering technique is a great way to continue developing prints that you didn't like the first time around. Are you ready to see the final results? All of the prints are dry now, and you can truly appreciate all the detail. Here's the first paper I did where I dropped the ink and soap in the center of the water, creating large concentric rings. This is the second print I did where I started the rings in multiple locations. It created a lot more movement on the surface, and the ink rings changed shapes when they ran into each other. I dropped the paper too fast here and got some streaks in the pattern when it printed. This is the secondary print I took with the leftover ink on the water. The pattern is completely different because the ink moved after I pulled the first print. So ghost prints in Suminagashi don't look like a lighter copy of the original print. They print a different pattern. This is the print where I fanned the water back and forth, creating a more jagged pattern. I got these lines in the print because of the way I hesitated when I put the paper on the surface. This is the print where I was blowing in the same direction, which made the water swirl on both sides, creating this design. I did rip this paper after printing when I tried to move the wet paper, so just remember to be careful. This is the one where I used the toothpick. I put different spots of ink around, and then I dragged the toothpick through the water, which created all these small swirls. Now, these darker prints are actually double-sided. The print is lighter on the backside, but the ink goes all the way through, and both sides are gorgeous. The double-sided prints are great for journals and folding projects. I folded this print into a collapsible box. It folds completely flat so you can attach it to a journal page. This print is where I sprayed the rubbing alcohol all over the surface of the water. That caused some of the ink to sink in the water, but some ink remained on the surface and created these really interesting textures. This print is so gorgeous and detailed in person. I think it's my favorite print from this session. This is the one where I dropped rubbing alcohol on the surface. Wherever a drop of rubbing alcohol touched the ink, it created these little spirals. You have to try this one to see it for yourself. It's really magical to watch how the ink spirals. This is the one where I used a strand of hair to pull through the water from the center outward. It creates a spider web-like pattern. And this one goes through onto the back side. This is another one where I pulled a strand of hair again, but I pulled inward towards the center. It creates a really beautiful spiral at the center and looks like flower petals around the outside. This dark print also goes through to the back side. This is the one where I put a lot of ink on the surface and manipulated it with my soap brush because I wanted really good coverage. Then I floated 2 masks on the water before I put my paper down, so it didn't print where the masks were on the surface of the water. I did get a few air bubbles next to the masks that didn't print. This one is also quite dark, so you can see the design on the back side too. This is the same technique, just using leaf masks floated on the water. You can see where the masks shifted when I was laying down the paper, but I still love this print. It has a beautiful marbling pattern in the background. This is the one where I printed over one of the light gray ghost prints. You can see the light gray marbling in the background. I printed the dark rings over top of it. I probably should have left some more open spaces so that you could see more of the lighter pattern underneath. Something interesting happened with this print though, which is why I wanted to show it to you. It has these paper towel impressions on here. I think what happened is that I was drying my prints on paper towels and the ghost print was not 100% dry in these areas. So when I printed the second print, the ink didn't print in those areas, leaving the paper towel pattern behind. Here's the print where I painted clean watermarks on the paper before printing. The ink won't print onto the wet areas of the paper, so the marbling shows up in the negative space around the brush marks. I think there's a lot more possibilities to explore with this technique. I hope you have fun experimenting and trying all of these techniques. Don't forget to grab your Suminagashi prompt cards so you can remember how to do each technique. Get the free prompt cards at the link in the video description. If you want to learn more ways to make beautiful collage papers with ink and household items, watch my video on 7 ways to make inky collage papers.